Imagine stepping into a sweltering 8th century souk where the air smells like half-cooked kebabs and the sand whispers jokes you're too polite to laugh at, because tonight we're unearthing the riotously irreverent legend of Abu Nawas, the original bad boy of wisdom who could outwit a tax collector while sipping date wine straight from the pot. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love a good mischief story, and drop a comment telling me the most outrageous prank you've pulled, because trust me, Abu would approve. Now, dim the lights, kick off your shoes, and let the flicker of a lone oil lamp be your guide as we slip behind the curtain of history. You feel the heat of the sun still clinging to the stone walls, hear a camel's bell tinker like a lazy metronome, and smell the sweet rot of figs left too long in the market. Just the kind of ambience that makes a wise-cracking rogue feel right at home. Abu Nawas waddles in, robe half-torn, grin wider than a camel's grin, offering riddles sharper than a chef's knife, while his followers gasp, snort, and secretly cheer at his cheeky defiance of every respectable norm. So tell me, would you dare trade your Wi-Fi for a night of storytelling under a desert sky? Type yes or no in the comments, and let's see if modern comfort can survive a dose of ancient chaos. The sun baked Basra's tangled alleys into a maze of heat and spice. Among the clatter of carts and the cries of fishmongers, a gaunt orphan named Abu Nawas slipped between shadows, his bare feet slick with salty water. He survived on crumbs and clever tricks, stealing a date palm's fruit with the grace of a street magician. One sweltering afternoon, a humble merchant named Karim stopped his camel, eyes drawn to the boy's quick grin. Sensing hunger and fire in the child's eyes, Karim offered a scrap of flatbread, and without a contract, adopted the wily waif. Abu Nawas devoured stories the way others devoured bread, memorizing verses from wandering dervishes. He transformed the market's gossip into riddles that made the spice sellers stop mid-haggling, their eyebrows rising like freshly baked figs. One evening, he posed a puzzle to a grizzled boatman. What walks on 4 legs at dawn, 2 at noon, and 3 when it's drunk? The answer, a goat, a man, and a man on a donkey after too many dates, sent the crowd into uproarious laughter. Karim laughed harder, realizing his ward's sharp tongue could carve a path straight to the caliph's golden palace. Word of the boy-wit traveled faster than a desert wind, slipping into the marble corridors of the caliph's court. The vizier, a man who counted his gold like he counted his prayers, summoned Abu Nawas for a midnight challenge. The palace's opulent hall smelled of incense and polished sandalwood, yet Abu felt the same tickle of mischief on his tongue. He arrived wearing a patched tunic, a grin wider than the Euphrates, and a sack of riddles strapped to his back. The courtiers, draped in silks, watched as he turned the caliph's stern decree into a joke about a camel that refused to pray, earning a rare chuckle from the ruler himself. The caliph, intrigued, posed his own brain teaser. What is a tongue that never speaks? Abu Nawas stared at the jeweled throne, then whispered, "A shoe, my lord, unless it's one of those fashionable sandals the youth wear on TikTok." Laughter rippled through the marble colonnade, and even the stern guards snorted as if they'd tasted fermented dates. The caliph rose, clapping with a gilded hand, declaring Abu his official jester scholar, a title as paradoxical as a desert oasis that sells Wi-Fi. From that moment, Abu's mischief was sanctioned, his riddles now served on gilded platters beside honeyed figs. With a royal seal tucked into his pocket, Abu Nawas stepped back onto Basra's bustling streets, his heart thumping like a drum at a wedding feast. He knew the city's alleys now whispered his name, and every donkey driver eyed him as both a threat and a treasure. The scent of frying fish mingled with the distant echo of minstrels, promising new puzzles and daring escapades. As the moon rose, painting the dunes silver, Abu smiled, ready to turn every royal decree into a punchline and every hardship into a tale worth retelling. Thus began the legend of the wit who would outsmart sultans, outjoke poets, and perhaps one day outdance a Netflix binge-watcher in a desert rave. The palace courtyard throbbed with the clatter of copper pots and the sweet smoke of frankincense, while the caliph perched on his jeweled throne like a board game show host. He raised a jeweled hand and announced, "Abu Nawas, I will test your mind with riddles no scholar has solved." The courtiers leaned forward, their robes rustling like parchment, and the scent of spiced lamb wafted from nearby kitchens. Abu Nawas smiled, his eyes glittering like desert mirages, and whispered that even a donkey could answer if asked politely. The crowd hushed, waiting for the first impossible puzzle to drop. The first riddle hissed like a snake. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? Abu Nawas chuckled, recalling the old story of the man and his cane, but he flipped it, replying, "It's the camel that drinks coffee at sunrise, walks drunk at midday, and stumbles home on a rug at dusk." Laughter rippled through the marble columns, and the caliph's eyebrows rose, half amused, half bewildered. The answer wasn't what the scholars expected, but the humor struck a chord louder than any scholarly citation. The courtiers tasted the irony as sharp as the mint tea they sipped. A cluster of rival scholars, cloaked in dusty linens, narrowed their eyes, their beards twitching like overcooked kebabs. They muttered, "He's cheating with jokes," while the scent of burnt incense clung to their sleeves. Abu Nawas, unfazed, tossed a playful barb about the caliph's favorite falcon being a better poet than some of them. The scholars' envy boiled over, their cheeks flushing red as pomegranate skins. Still, the audience sensed a shift as the clever man turned a serious contest into a stand-up routine. The second riddle snapped like a whip. "I have cities but no houses, rivers without water, forests without trees. What am I?" Abu Nawas glanced at the tapestry of maps behind the throne, then grinned. "A Wi-Fi signal, Your Majesty. Connects everything yet nothing you can touch." The court erupted, some startled, some bewildered by the modern analogy, as the caliph's chuckle echoed against the stone arches. The final challenge was a tongue twister about a sack of sand that refused to stay still, and Abu Nawas answered with a flamboyant dance, kicking up dust that smelled of cumin and sweat. The judges blinked, half in awe, half in disbelief, as the clever rogue turned riddles into a circus of wit. When the dust settled, the caliph rose, clapping his hands like thunder, and declared Abu Nawas the victor, awarding him a golden satchel of dates and a brass lantern that sang when lit. The crowd roared, the scent of victory mingling with the lingering aroma of roasted chickpeas. Yet behind the applause, a few scholars plotted, their envy simmering like a stew left too long over fire. Abu Nawas bowed, his smile as wide as the Euphrates, and whispered that the true prize was the laughter that still rang in the halls. The story of his first trial spread through bazaars, where storytellers would later recount how a man turned impossible riddles into a comedy show worthy of Netflix. The sun baked the palace courtyard like a furnace, and the scent of dry dust rose from the empty fields as the kingdom's granaries whispered of scarcity. Word traveled faster than a camel's gossip. Famine stalked the streets, turning mothers' eyes hollow and the market stalls into graveyards of broken jars. In his silk-lined throne room, the Sultan slammed his jeweled sword onto the marble floor, demanding a miracle to feed his starving subjects. He summoned Abu Nawas, the roving raconteur whose jokes could make a stone statue giggle, and ordered him to devise a plan before the next moon rose. The court fell silent, except for the nervous clatter of a lone mouse scurrying across the heated tiles. Abu Nawas chuckled, his his beard twitching like a windswept reed, and slipped into the palace pantry, where sacks of grain lay hidden beneath a false floor. The stale, sweet smell of barley clung to his nostrils, a reminder that the kingdom's hidden stores were still full, like a secret stash of popcorn waiting for a movie night. He recalled a legend about a desert oasis that appeared when a thirsty traveler sang a song, and his mind sparked with a mischievous scheme. With a wink, he whispered to his apprentice, "We'll sell the illusion of endless bread and let the people think the wheat grew on their roofs." He slipped a scroll into his satchel, its ink still glistening like fresh rain, ready to draft the most audacious ruse of his career. The next dawn, Abu Nawas stood atop the city walls, his voice booming louder than a bazooka in a quiet tavern, proclaiming that the heavens had opened and grain rained down from the sky. He released a cascade of golden flour from hidden barrels, the powder puffing through the air like fireworks at a New Year's feast, coating the bewildered crowd in a fine, buttery dust. Children squealed, adults coughed, and the Sultan's vizier stared as if someone had just streamed a live-action video of a popcorn machine exploding. Abu Nawas then led volunteers to the secret storerooms, where they pretended to harvest the miraculous grain, shoveling it into baskets with the theatrical flair of a Broadway choreographer. The people cheered, their bellies full of hope and their faces smudged with flour, while the Sultan scratched his head, half amazed and half wondering if he'd just been outwitted by a stand-up comic. As night fell, the palace kitchens roared to life, the clatter of pots and the sizzle of oil echoing like a rock concert in the stone halls. The aroma of freshly baked flatbread mingled with the sweet perfume of dates, drifting through narrow alleys and coaxing even the most cynical beggar to smile. The Sultan, still in his silk robes, tasted a warm piece of bread and felt the weight of his crown lift, realizing that his people's survival hinged on clever deception rather than sheer force. He praised Abu Nawas, dubbing him Har, the Sultan's secret weapon, while secretly wondering if he should hire the Trickster as an official advisor on all future crises. Meanwhile, Abu Nawas winked at the moon, thinking that if this tale ever made it to the future, it would be as legendary as a superhero origin story, but with more cumin and less cape. By sunrise, the famine's grip loosened. The walls of the granaries no longer echoed with emptiness, but with the soft rustle of redistributed grain. Traders from distant lands whispered about the kingdom's miraculous bounty, their caravans arriving with exotic spices, only to be turned away with a grin and a cheeky, "We've got enough hummus for everyone." Abu Nawas' reputation swelled, his name now spoken in taverns alongside heroes like Gilgamesh, and even the occasional pop culture icon. This is the man who turned a pantry into a popcorn miracle, like an ancient Netflix binge. The Sultan, his beard dusted with flour, thanked the cunning storyteller, aware that the true power of a ruler lies not just in swords, but in stories that feed both body and soul. And so, the kingdom learned that a little wit could turn a dire drought into a feast. Proof that sometimes the best solutions are served with a side of sarcasm and a sprinkle of spice. The moon hung like a polished coin over the palace courtyard, casting a silver glow on a sea of embroidered carpets. Lanterns sputtered amber fire, their scent of frankincense battling the sharp tang of spiced kebabs simmering in copper cauldrons. Musicians plucked out strings, sending lilting notes that rippled through the fragrant air like fish in a marble fountain. The Sultan reclined on a throne of gold-inlaid teak, his beard shimmering with rosewater, eyes glittering with the promise of a night that would be spoken of for generations. All the court's nobles swarmed the banquet hall, each trying to outshine the other with jeweled robes and boisterous laughter. When the last drumbeat faded, the Sultan rose, his voice rolling like thunder over the clinking of goblets. He fixed his gaze on Abu Nawas, the famed rogue whose wit was as sharp as a scimitar, and issued a paradox. "Serve a feast, my friend, but bring no food." A murmur rippled through the hall. Servers paused, knives glittered, and even the incense seemed to hold its breath. The Sultan's smile curled like a cat's whisker. He wanted to watch Abu Nawas wrestle with an impossible order, perhaps to see the fool humbled. The courtiers leaned in, their curiosity as thick as the honey-drizzled figs that lined the tables. Abu Nawas bowed low, his eyes twinkling like desert stars, and whispered, "My lord, the banquet shall be served on the palate of the heart." He summoned his apprentices, who rushed to fill empty plates with fragrant air, spilling scented breezes that smelled of cumin, rose, and roasted lamb without a morsel to bite. He scattered rose petals, let the scent of fresh bread waft from hidden ovens, and poured wine that glittered like liquid amber, urging the guests to taste the imagination itself. Laughter erupted as the nobles pretended to chew invisible kebabs, slurping the scent of garlic as if it were broth, while Abu Nawas narrated each bite with a comic tale of a donkey that tried to eat its own shadow. The irony was delicious. They feasted on nothing, yet their bellies swelled with pride and mirth. Just as the hall roared with applause, the Sultan's guards stepped forward, sword sheathed but eyes sharp as a hawk's. The king whispered, "Enough games, Nawas. Prove you can feed the kingdom." With a grin, Abu Nawas lifted a humble sack of dates hidden beneath the cushions and tossed them into the crowd, the sweet fruit cracking like tiny fireworks upon impact. He declared, "Generosity is not measured by the size of the platter, but by the willingness to share the last bite." The Sultan, humbled by the simplicity, lowered his sword, his cheeks flushing hotter than the braziers, and proclaimed Abu Nawas a hero who saved the realm's honor without spilling a single grain of rice. The guests erupted in cheers, their gratitude echoing louder than any drum, while the palace cook sighed in relief, his apron no longer stained with panic. Later, as the night waned and the courtyard candles flickered out like dying fireflies, Abu Nawas slipped away with a cheeky salute, his coat swaying like a desert dune. He muttered to himself, "If only Netflix had a series on banquets without food. Now that would be binge-watch material." The Sultan, still clutching a date, smiled and ordered a new feast, this time with real plates, remembering that true greatness feeds both body and ego. The courtiers retold the tale in taverns, each embellishment adding another layer of humor, until the story itself became as legendary as the Sultan's jeweled crown. And so, the kingdom learned that a clever mind can turn even an empty plate into a banquet of humility, generosity, and a dash of absurdity. When the sun dipped behind the palms, Abu Nawas slipped away from the bustling bazaar and settled into his modest garden, a patch of earth scented with rosemary and dried figs. The wind tugged at the rust leaves, scattering the sweet perfume of orange blossoms over the stone benches. He sank onto a cool mosaic tile, feeling the grit of centuries beneath his feet, and chuckled at the thought that a man who once outwitted a sultan could now be outwitted by a mischievous sparrow. The garden hummed with cicadas, their chorus like a drumbeat to his thoughts, while a nearby fountain splashed a bright rhythm against the quiet. In that tranquil hush, Abu Nawas sensed the perfect stage for his final act, teaching the next generation with laughter and love. Soon, a gaggle of curious children crept through the vine-covered archway, their cheeks flushed from chasing mangoes and their eyes glittering with anticipation. They gathered around the old storyteller, their small hands clutching battered leather sandals and half-eaten dates, while a stray goat bleated nearby, adding a comedic soundtrack to the scene. Abu Nawas lifted his weathered hands like a magician, and the garden seemed to lean in, the scent of earth and incense mingling with the faint tang of sweat from the kid's exertions. He began with a twinkle. Once I told a tyrant that his beard was a broom for his crooked thoughts, and the children burst into giggles, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. The air crackled with excitement, each tale promising a splash of wit to wash away the dust of oppression. He spun the tale of the greedy vizier who tried to tax the moon, demanding the night's silvery glow for his treasury. Abu Nawas described how the vizier's men trudged through mud, their boots squelching, only to be chased by a mischievous cat that stole their moon-shaped lanterns and dropped them into a pond, turning the water into glowing cheese. The children gasped at the smell of burnt incense and the sight of frogs leaping in moonlight, while Abu winked. Even the fish laugh when tyrants try to count stars. The story swirled with irony, showing that a sly fox, actually a desert jackal in disguise, outsmarted the vizier by swapping his royal decree with a love letter to a dancing camel. By the end, the children were rolling on the ground, delighted by the absurdity and the subtle reminder that cleverness can crumble even the mightiest crown. Word of Abu Nawas's garden gatherings spread faster than gossip at the caravanserai, sailing on the backs of wandering dervishes and whispering winds. The tales slipped into market stalls, tucked beside fragrant spices and glittering copper lanterns, where merchants would pause to recount the fox-jackal's trick to eager listeners. Even the town's drunk poet, whose verses smelled of wine and pipe smoke, began chanting Abu's stories in taverns, adding a lute riff that made the crowd sway like palm fronds in a storm. Over years, the narratives grew legs, sprouting new verses as children added their own daring twists, turning each story into a living, breathing folktale. The garden, once a private sanctuary, became a cultural seedbed, its roots intertwined with the very fabric of the city's collective memory. Now, when the moon hangs low over the minarets, elders recall Abu Nawas's quiet garden as the birthplace of a legacy that still chuckles at tyranny. They tell their grandchildren that wit is sharper than a scimitar and compassion softer than a silk shawl, urging them to sprinkle humor on the harshest of days. A stray cat still prowls the marble steps, its tail flickering like a metronome to the rhythm of stories told around flickering fire pits. And whenever a ruler tries to tighten his grip, the people whisper, "Ask Abu," as if invoking a secret password for freedom. In this way, the laughter of a retired sage ripples through centuries, proving that a well-placed joke can topple empires as surely as any sword. The sun hammered the cobbles of Baghdad's great bazaar like a drum, and the air throbbed with the clatter of merchants, the hiss of frying kebabs, and the sweet perfume of frankincense. Stalls piled with lacquered copper pots, scarlet rugs, and jars of dates formed a maze that smelled of cumin, goat sweat, and the occasional waft of sandalwood incense. Children darted between arches, their laughter ricocheting off arches, while old men haggled over figs, their faces crinkled like parchment maps. In the midst of this swirling circus, a wiry wanderer named Juha slipped through the crowd, his patched robe fluttering like a banner of mischief. He paused at a fragrant spice stall, inhaling the sharp bite of sumac and thinking, if I'm here to earn a story, I'll need a story worth telling. A burly merchant named Hakim, whose beard was as tangled as the market's rope ladders, beckoned Juha with a grin that hinted at hidden agendas. Hakim's stall glimmered with polished brass lamps that reflected the sun in 1,000 tiny suns, and the scent of roasted coffee beans curled around their warm glow. "Ah, Juha," the merchant called, slapping his own belly as if to say, "Welcome to my belly of bargains," and offered a steaming cup that tasted like midnight in a desert. Between sips, Hakim whispered that the Sultan himself had summoned a council to resolve a bitter dispute over the right to tax the river's fish, and he needed a mind sharp enough to untangle it. The merchant's eyes twinkled like a mischievous jinn, and he nudged Juha toward the palace, promising that a clever answer would earn him fame brighter than the lanterns above. Word had already spread through the bazaar that the Sultan, a man who loved riddles as much as he loved his jeweled robes, demanded a witty solution before nightfall. The dispute centered on two noble families, arguing whether the palace's golden crane, an ornamental fountain, should belong to the water keepers or the silk merchants, a quarrel fiercer than a camel's temper when it spots a desert oasis. The court's scribes swore the argument would drown the city in paperwork, while the palace cooks muttered that they'd rather eat burnt flatbread than listen to endless debates. Hakim, with a wink, told Juha that the Sultan had declared, "Bring me a verdict that makes the moon laugh, or I will have the bazaar shutters shut forever." The crowds murmured, the incense swirled, and a nervous shiver ran down Juha's spine, as if the market itself were holding its breath for a punchline. Juha scratched his head, stared at a nearby goat that was happily nibbling on a sack of figs, and the animal let out a squeaky protest that sounded oddly like a squeaky toy laugh. Inspired, he announced to the assembled merchants that the golden crane would become a shared symbol, declaring, "Let the water keepers paint its feathers blue, and the silk merchants drape its base in the finest brocade, so every sunrise will see both water and silk dancing together." He added with a grin, "If the crane ever tips, we shall blame the moon's mischievous grin and blame it on the night's TikTok dance trend," pulling a chuckle from the stoic guards. The Sultan, perched on a velvet cushion, burst into a hearty laugh that rattled his jeweled turban, declaring Juha's answer as bright as a lantern in a storm. The two feuding families, faced with such a ludicrous yet elegant compromise, bowed their heads and agreed, realizing that a shared masterpiece was far sweeter than solitary glory. With the dispute settled, Hakim clapped Juha on the back, the sound echoing like a drum roll at a circus finale, and handed him a sack of golden dates as a token of gratitude. The bazaar erupted in cheers, the scent of roasted nuts mixing with the fresh rain that began to fall, washing away the lingering smell of goat urine and incense in equal measure. Children chased each other beneath the awnings, shouting, "Juha the Jester," as if he were a living meme from the streets of Baghdad. Juha, his eyes sparkling like polished amber, slipped away into the winding alleys, already plotting his next trick, because a legend never sleeps when the market is alive. And so the tale of his clever solution spread beyond the city walls, whispered in caravans and coffeehouses, cementing his reputation as the mind that could make even a sultan giggle, proof that wit, like spice, is best when shared hot. The sun blazed over Baghdad as the royal trumpets cracked like a mischievous jackal, beckoning Juha to the sultan's marble courtyard. He arrived clutching his worn satchel, the smell of spiced dates and camel dung mingling in the humid air. Guarded arches glimmered with mosaics of sapphire and gold, while palace servants fanned fragrant jasmine breezes over the polished stones. Juha tipped his floppy hat, eyes twinkling, ready to trade his notorious wit for a slice of royal favor. Inside the throne room, the Sultan rose on a throne that resembled a floating cloud, his beard shimmering like spun silk. He announced a riddle. A pearl slipped from the sea, now hidden in the palace, yet none may claim it without a word. The courtiers leaned in, their silk robes rustling like a flock of startled pigeons, and the air grew thick with incense and suspicion. Juha sensed the weight of the kingdom's honor pressing like a sandal on his ankle, but he smiled, recalling the time he once turned a camel's stubbornness into a joke about Netflix binge-watching. Soon, the whispering eunuchs began to scheme, their murmurs sliding between marble columns like slippery eels. One plotted to send a mutinous guard to steal the pearl. Another plotted to frame Juha with a forged scroll of riddles. The scent of sweat and roasted lamb draped the conspirators, their nerves humming like a lute out of tune. Juha, however, slipped a sandal-shaped cracker into the Sultan's palm, cracking it loudly to snap the court's tension like a firecracker on a dusty road. When the Sultan demanded an answer, Juha rose, his voice echoing off the gilded walls like a desert wind over dunes. "Great Sultan," he declared, "the pearl you seek is not a gem at all, but the laughter that rings when a donkey tries to wear a crown." The courtiers gasped. Some choked on their own perfume, while the Sultan's eyebrows rose like the twin towers of a sandcastle. A ripple of laughter erupted, spilling over the hall, and even the stern vizier cracked a grin, his mustache twitching in delight. The Sultan, humbled yet amused, declared Juha's answer worthy of the kingdom's honor, and the lost pearl was revealed to be a simple white marble hidden beneath a rug, a symbolic reminder of humility. As servants served sweet honeyed figs, the conspirators slunk away, their plots dissolving like sugar in tea. Juha bowed, his satchel now brimming with golden dates and a royal decree promising future riddles. The palace buzzed with the sound of clinking cups, the scent of victory in sandalwood, and the echo of Juha's joke that even a sultan can be outwitted by a humble clown, reminding everyone that wit is the brightest pearl of all. Juha slipped onto the creaking caravan like a mischievous dune mouse, his striped cloak fluttering against the merciless sun. The caravan snaked across the endless sea of sand, each camel's breath a puff of dust that smelled of burnt incense and sweat. Traders chattered in clattering Arabic, their voices mingling with the clink of brass bowls and the occasional squeak of a goat with a sore hoof. In the distance, a storm gathered, its clouds bruising the horizon like a bruised orange peel. Juha, ever the jester, tipped his fez and whispered, "If we survive this, I'll trade my jokes for a camel's lunchbox." The sandstorm hit with the fury of 1,000 scorpions, hurling coarse grains into every eye and nostril, turning the sky into a blinding white-gray soup. Travelers shrieked, clutching their robes as if they were trying to catch a slippery fish, while a chorus of camel grunts rose like a low-frequency bass line. Juha shouted over the howl, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world's biggest sandpaper exfoliation." He spun a tale of a genie who mistook the storm for a giant's sneeze, drawing raucous laughter that cut through the roar. The humor steadied trembling hands, and the caravan's pace steadied, each footstep now a beat in Juha's impromptu desert drumming. When the gale finally relented, the caravan halted beside a lone, half-buried oasis that smelled of sour dates and stale camel dung. The chief, a towering man named al-Hakim, was nowhere to be found. His tent lay open, its silk curtains fluttering like startled moths. Gossip swirled faster than a falcon in a wind tunnel. Some whispered that he'd fled with the treasure. Others claimed a sand spirit had abducted him. Juha, with a grin as wide as a desert horizon, quipped, "If the chief is missing, perhaps he's hiding in the Wi-Fi dead zone of the dunes." He nudged a sleepy guard awake, and together they scoured the ground, discovering a set of fresh footprints leading toward a hidden alcove. Following the prints, Juha uncovered a secret stash of jeweled trinkets, glittering under a veil of sand, guarded by a sly trader named Rafiq, who wore a smile as crooked as a camel's hump. Rafiq confessed, over a shared cup of bitter tea, that he had conspired with the chief to siphon off a portion of the caravan's profits, planning to disappear into the desert's mythic no-map zone. Juha laughed, slapping Rafiq's back. "You're about as discreet as a pop-up ad on a medieval scroll." He then turned to the assembled travelers, proclaiming that the real treasure was the ability to turn betrayal into a punchline. The crowd roared, their anger dissolving into applause, as Juha promised to keep the chief's fate a secret, so long as Rafiq supplied fresh dates for the journey. With the storm behind them and the betrayal exposed, the caravan resumed its march, the camels' hooves thudding like drumbeats on a grand parade. Juha rode at the front, his jokes now a chorus of cheers that echoed across the dunes, lifting spirits higher than a kite caught in a gale. The night fell, bringing a cool breeze scented with jasmine and the faint stink of burnt incense, and the travelers settled around a fire that crackled like an old storyteller's laugh. Juha closed the day with a final quip. Remember, dear friends, in the desert of life, it's the humor that keeps the sand out of our eyes. The caravan, now bound by mirth and newfound trust, faded into the starlit horizon, their silhouettes a testament to wit's enduring power. The moon hung like a silver lantern over the marble courtyard of the caliph's palace, casting long shadows that danced on the mosaic floor. Juha slipped out of the servants' quarters, his sandals slapping against the cool stones that smelled of stale incense and spilled dates. A distant muezzin's call blended with the croaking of night frogs, creating a soundtrack that sounded suspiciously like a medieval remix. He paused beneath a lantern swaying in the breeze, its oil flicker painting his grin in amber light. Tonight, the legendary wit of Juha would be tested in a duel of words that could make even the most stoic vizier blush. The vizier, a silk-clad schemer with a mustache as sharp as a scimitar, waited by the garden fountain, a sly smile curling his lips. He waved a jeweled scroll, declaring a riddling challenge that smelled of spiced figs and political intrigue. Answer my puzzle, fool, or be banished to the desert where the sand gnaws at your tongue. He snarled, his words echoing off the mosaics like a badly dubbed movie trailer. The trap was set, a question so twisted that even a scholar from Cordoba would need a GPS to navigate its logic. Yet Juha, ever the streetwise troubadour, sensed the vizier's impatience and the faint stink of sweat that betrayed his nervousness. Juha bowed theatrically, his voice rolling like a drumbeat in a tavern, and launched into a tale of a camel that tried to audition for fast and furious desert drift. He described the beast's horned nose sputtering sand, its hooves pounding the dunes like a subwoofer on a Saturday night. The crowd of night watch guards chuckled, the sound crackling like firewood, while the vizier's eyebrows lifted in bewildered awe. With each absurd twist, Juha wove in a riddle about a hidden key that lay beneath the palace's leaky roof, smelling faintly of mildew and monkey droppings. The vizier, caught between fury and fascination, tried to follow the logic, his mind as tangled as a cat-in-a-bag puzzle. Suddenly, Juha flipped the script, declaring that the true key was the vizier's own cleverness, which he had carelessly left on a tray of steaming kebabs. The vizier's face turned a shade of crimson that could rival the pomegranate glaze on a royal banquet dish. As the crowd erupted in laughter, a stray cat darted across the courtyard, scattering a pile of rotting figs that splattered like graffiti on the marble. The vizier's trap collapsed under the weight of his own hubris, the scroll unraveling into a mess of ink that smelled like old wine and regret. Juha seized the moment, brandishing a rose-scented pipe and blowing a cloud of smoke that curled around the vizier's head like a comedic villain's cape. With the vizier humbled, Juha delivered the final flourish, a punchy proverb about how the sharpest sword is a sharper tongue, punctuated by a wink that would make a modern meme lord proud. The moonbright reflected off the vizier's tears, turning them into liquid silver that dripped onto the thirsty stones below. The caliph, hearing the commotion, stepped out in his flowing someone spilled amber over Baghdad, the crowds gathered in the courtyard as the vizier's shady scheme was ripped apart like a torn parchment. The Sultan, his beard glinting with fresh victory, slapped a golden coin onto Juha's palm, and the onlookers roared louder than a bazaar full of shouting merchants. Juha, the wandering fool with a grin as crooked as the city's alleys, bowed low, his sandaled feet kicking up the dust that smelled of cumin and sweat. He whispered, "Even a snake in a silk robe can't hide from a laughing heart," a jab that sent the minister's red face turning the shade of ripe pomegranate. The palace band struck a jubilant drumbeat that made the stone walls tremble, announcing the triumph of wit over treachery. The city erupted into a carnival of color, with banners fluttering like gossiping sparrows. Street cooks flung sizzling kebabs into the air, their charred perfume mingling with the sweet scent of rosewater from fountains. Music swelled, an ode strummed faster than a horse's gallop, and children's giggles cracked like firecrackers. Even the stinky goat market, usually a source of contempt, was transformed, as merchants tossed jokes like fresh figs, and the odor became background comedy. Juha hopped onto a low wall, delivering punchlines that slapped the crowd awake, making them forget the vizier's betrayal as if it were yesterday's stale bread. Amid the revelry, a wounded soldier limped into the square, his armor dented and his spirit cracked like a cracked pot. Juha knelt, pulled a rubber chicken from his satchel. Yes, a rubber chicken, the medieval equivalent of a meme, and pretended it was a mighty falcon. He squawked, "Fear not, brave man, for my bird can peck away your pain." And the soldier burst into a belly laugh that rattled his ribs. The laughter scattered the ache like moths fleeing a candle, and the bloodied wound seemed to stitch itself with invisible threads of mirth. Soon, a chorus of chuckles rose, turning the square into a living antiseptic, where humor acted as the surgeon's scalpel. The Sultan, watching from his marble balcony, realized that his empire's greatest treasure was not gold, but the echo of collective laughter, louder than any war cry. He declared a holiday, Day of the Chuckle, to be celebrated each year, promising free feasts and comedy nights that would make even a stoic scholar giggle like a sitcom character. People in turbans and veils began swapping jokes as quickly as they swapped spices, creating a cultural meme that spread faster than a rumor about a new camel emoji. Even the palace scholars, usually buried in dusty scrolls, started quoting Juha's witticisms in lectures, proving that a joke could be as enlightening as a lantern in a dark library. In that moment, the golden age glimmered brighter, because jokes stitched together the diverse tapestry of the city like a master weaver stitching silk. When the sun finally slipped behind the minarets, Juha stood before the gathering, his eyes twinkling like lanterns caught in a breeze. He said, "Laughter is the mortar that holds our walls. Without it, we crumble like stale baklava." The crowd erupted, their cheers mixing with the night's cool scent of jasmine and incense, a reminder that joy can soften even the harshest stone. From that night forward, whenever conflict brewed, citizens would summon a joke, letting humor dissolve tension like sugar in tea. Thus the legend of Juha's wit spread across the empire, a timeless reminder that a single laugh can heal wounds, unite peoples, and keep the golden age forever bright. In the scorching heat of ancient Persia, the great palace of King Shahryar rose like a sun-bleached citadel, its marble corridors echoing with the clatter of horse hooves and the perfume of spiced incense. He was a ruler bruised by betrayal, his heart a cracked goblet that spilled fury after discovering his trusted queen consort's secret tryst. The shame festered like a rat in the pantry, and he swore, with a voice that cracked like a whip, to marry a new bride each night and cast her into oblivion at first dawn. The court whispered, the drums rattled, and the scent of fresh figs turned sour as the king king's resolve hardened into a cruel ritual. Thus, the kingdom braced itself for a nightly carousel of love and death, a spectacle as bewildering as a reality show finale gone wrong. When the royal decree thundered through the halls, courtiers scrambled like kitchen staff during a banquet fire, clutching scrolls that announced the king's macabre calendar. Each twilight, a trembling maiden would be led to the silken chambers, her heart pounding like a drum in a war march, while servants polished the swords that gleamed with morning dew. At sunrise, the palace gates flung open, and the king's blade sang a sharp, metallic aria, slicing through the quiet as if the heavens themselves were being split. Blood mingled with the sweet smell of rose water, creating a grotesque perfume that would linger on the tapestries for days. The whole enterprise felt as absurd as a Netflix binge, where every episode ends with the protagonist being vaporized. Except there was no skip intro button for the victims. Enter the vizier, an old fox with twinkling eyes, who had watched the king's madness from the shaded arches of the palace like a discreet paparazzo. When the royal edict threatened to turn the kingdom into a graveyard of brides, the vizier offered his own daughter, Scheherazade, a woman whose wit cut sharper than a scimitar. She stepped forward, her voice steady as desert wind, declaring, "Let me marry you, O king, and spin a tale each night that will keep you hungry for more." Her laughter rang with irony. She was essentially volunteering for the most extreme reality TV showdown ever, except the stakes were literally life and death. The court gasped, the servants clutched their aprons, and a pungent mix of sandalwood and fear filled the air as the vizier bowed, hoping his gamble would not backfire like a badly timed fireworks display. That very night, under a moon that glittered like spilled silver, Scheherazade slipped into the king's chambers, her fingers trembling with both terror and purpose. She unraveled a tapestry of words, beginning with a daring thief named Ali Baba who whispered to hidden doors, while the scent of roasted lamb wafted from the kitchen, distracting the king's appetite for blood. Each sentence she spun was a lantern, casting light on heroes, genies, and clever merchants. And she paused at the cliff of climax, leaving the king hanging like a cat on a yarn ball. The king, hooked like a binge watcher, unable to click next episode, demanded the story's end, but Scheherazade smiled, promising the conclusion would arrive with morning's first light. Thus began a nightly duel of curiosity versus cruelty, with the palace walls soaking up the echo of her voice, the rustle of parchment, and the distant howl of a desert wind that seemed to chant, "Keep talking." As days turned into weeks, the king's fury simmered like a pot of slow-cooked stew, his nightmares filled with whispers of unfinished tales and the lingering taste of incense-spiced blood. Scheherazade's audience grew restless. Courtiers whispered that she might outlast the king's beard, while the palace cats stalked the shadows, their fur bristling at the electric tension. Each dawn, the royal executioner sharpened his blade, the steel humming like a guitar string waiting for a final chord. Yet the king held his hand, craving the next story like a child, craving the next slice of pizza. The looming conflict crackled in the air, as palpable as the heat rising from the courtyard furnace, promising that either the king would be humbled by imagination, or Scheherazade would become the first historic figure to binge-watch her own life. And so, with the night's curtain drawn, the palace prepared for another round of storytelling, a battle where words were swords, and the only armor was a clever twist of fate. When the moon slipped behind the towers of ancient Babylon, Scheherazade lit a crackling fire and began her first night with a gasp-filled whisper. She pulled the listeners back to the Persian steppes, where rust-red sand swirled around heroic riders chanting verses that smelled of cumin and horse sweat. The tale leapt across the desert to the Indian subcontinent, where mischievous jackals chattered in bazaars, awash with spice-laden air and the clatter of copper pots. Her voice wove a tapestry of myths so vivid that even the night insects seemed to pause, buzzing in applause. In that moment, the audience realized they were hearing the raw ingredients of a legend still simmering in the pot of time. Oral storytellers, those ancient TikTokers with a penchant for memory, guarded cultural memory like a hamster hoarding sunflower seeds. They roamed from village to village, their tongues slick with honeyed metaphors, and their shoes caked in mud that smelled of goat cheese and river reeds. With each retelling, they added a pinch of wit, a dash of irony. Imagine a sultan who, after being warned by a clever fox, still tried to outwit his own shadow. The crowd chuckled as a wandering bard exaggerated a hero's mustache to the length of a camel's tail, only to reveal the moral that pride, like bad stew, can spoil everything. Through laughter and gasps, the storytellers stitched together fragments that would later bloom into the famed 1001 Nights. From Persia rose the thunderous echo of the Shahnameh, a sprawling epic that roared louder than a bazooka at a tea ceremony. Heroes like Rostam hammered their swords against the wind, each swing sending sparks that glittered like fireworks over a moonlit oasis. The scent of burnt oil and fresh figs mingled as battles raged, and the audience could almost feel the heat of dragon breath on their cheeks. Scheherazade sang of love that burned brighter than a lantern in a storm, yet slipped into absurdity when a jealous sorceress turned a prince into a pigeon. Talk about a feathered fiasco. These Persian strands gave the knights their heroic backbone, a sturdy frame for later jokes about talking carpets and genie-filled Wi-Fi routers. Crossing the Hindu plateau, the Indian fables dripped with moral lessons wrapped in banana leaves and coconut shells. Panchatantra's clever foxes whispered secrets in the shade of teak trees, their fur slick with monsoon rain and the scent of wet earth. Children giggled as a boastful tiger tried to out-sing a nightingale, only to discover his roar sounded like a broken diesel engine. The storyteller painted market stalls awash in turmeric gold, where merchants haggled over silk that felt like buttery clouds. In these colorful yarns, Scheherazade found the seasoning that would make the nights both sweet and spicy, a recipe that even a modern foodie would Instagram with a Tosh legendary bite. Finally, the Babylonian myths crashed onto the scene like a thunderstorm over the ziggurat, deep and rumbling with the scent of incense and damp stone. Gods with beards longer than a scroll of parchment argued over mortal destinies, their voices echoing like distant drums in the night. A cunning goddess tricked a king into believing his crown was made of starlight, only to reveal it was a melted cheese wheel. Cue the royal cringe and the court's muffled giggle. These primordial tales sowed the seeds of wonder, planting roots that would grow into the infinite garden of 1001 Nights. As Scheherazade concluded, the audience could taste the promise of countless stories, each ready to unfurl like a carpet rolled out for an epic adventure. The caravan rolls like a river of sand, its wooden carts creaking under the weight of silk, spices, and endless bundles of parchment. Heat shimmers above the dunes, and the scent of frankincense mixes with the rancid odor of goat dung from the camel trains. Traders swap jokes about their camels' fickle appetites, while a minstrel strums a lyre, his fingers sticky with dates. In the distance, a sandstorm looms, threatening to swallow the whole troop like a giant vacuum cleaner. Yet the caravan presses on, each footstep a drumbeat echoing the age-old promise of stories yet to be told. By nightfall, the merchants gather around a flickering fire, their voices rising above the crackle of burning pine wood. They trade more than wares. A merchant from Basra spins a tale of a clever fox that outwits a sultan, while a Bedouin from Mecca adds a twist about a hidden oasis that sings like a siren. The stories hitch a ride on camelbacks, slipping into the pockets of travelers heading west toward the Mediterranean ports. On the dunes, a traveling merchant whispers the story of a cursed lamp, and a curious listener swears he heard the lamp hiccup like a sputtering engine. Each retelling adds a new garnish, a dash of humor, a pinch of irony, making the narrative richer than a spice bazaar. And when the caravan reaches the bustling bazaars of Damascus, Arab poets line up like eager DJs at a rave, ready to remix the ancient yarns. They lace each plot with Quranic allusions, sprinkling verses that glitter like moonlit pearls on a desert night. The Arabic tongue flows, rolling over syllables like sand dunes rolling over a windstorm, turning simple folk motifs into ornate mosaics of language. A poet named al-Rashid sighs dramatically while reciting a love story that now includes a mischievous jinn who steals socks, because why not add a little foot fetish to the mix? The crowd erupts in laughter, their cheers mingling with the smell of roasted coffee as the old tales gain fresh, aromatic layers. Not everyone applauds the makeover. The elder storytellers clutch their scrolls like prized relics and mutter about sacrilege. "We must not drown the ancient in this glitter," one whispers, eyes narrowed like desert moons. Younger listeners, however, snap their fingers like hip-hop fans at a beat drop, demanding faster twists and punchier morals. The tension crackles hotter than the midday sun, sparking debates over whether a tale of a heroic queen should now sport a sidekick who tweets prophetic riddles. Yet the caravan rolls onward, carrying both the reverent sighs of tradition and the electric buzz of innovation, each tug of the reins pulling the narrative in opposite directions. In the end, the caravan stories become a living tapestry, embroidered with threads of faith, humor, and the occasional pop culture wink. Think of a genie texting, "Your wish is my command," on a luminescent tablet. Travelers return to their homelands with scrolls that smell of incense and donkey sweat, passing them to friends who gasp at new verses about desert dragons that love karaoke. The mosaic glitters like the night sky over the Sahara, each star a tale that survived the heat, the dust, and the occasional camel flatulence. Scheherazade would grin, sipping tea sweetened with dates, delighted that her nights now echo in the bustling cafes of Andalusia. And so the caravan rides on, a moving library on hooves, forever weaving the old and the new into one intoxicating, unforgettable ride. On the 1000th night, the palace courtyard smelled of spiced incense and sweat, the torches sputtering like old gossip. Scheherazade stepped onto the marble dais, the silver moon spilling across her silken veil. She could hear the king's heavy breath echo through the stone arches, a metronome of menace and curiosity. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the story that might finally unthread the knot of vengeance that bound Shahryar's heart. She began with a wandering prince who, after his beloved was betrayed, swore vengeance as loudly as a rock star smashing a guitar on stage. The prince's rage stormed through deserts, leaving a trail of blood-stained sand and broken swords that sang a grim lullaby. Yet, as the night deepened, he stumbled upon an old hermit who offered him a simple cup of sour milk, the taste of humility shocking his hardened tongue. The prince learned that forgiveness could be sweeter than revenge, a lesson that glimmered like a jeweled dagger in the dark. King Shahryar sat rigid on his gilded throne, the candlelight flickering across the scars of his forearms, each one a reminder of battles fought and victims lost. He felt the story's rhythm pulse against his ribs, the echo of his own bloodthirst humming in his ears. A wry smile cracked his stern mask when Scheherazade whispered a line that sounded suspiciously like a Netflix tagline. Even the darkest villain can binge-watch a redemption arc. The irony stung, but it also pried open a crack in his armor, letting in a draft of old, dusty regrets. When the tale reached its climax, Scheherazade lowered her voice to a trembling chant, her words dripping like honey over the king's stone heart. She pleaded, not with grandiose petitions, but with the raw, unleashed 100 nights of his fury, and still believed in his spark of humanity. Grant me mercy, not because I'm clever, but because you once loved a woman who sang of sunrise, she said, the scent of jasmine mingling with the coppery tang of his own blood on the floor. The irony of her survival, hinging on his ability to be soft, made even the palace rats pause, their tiny whiskers twitching in anticipation. At last, Shahryar's eyes softened, the fire in his gaze dimming to a warm ember that barely curled smoke. He rose, his robe rustling like a tired dragon shedding scales, and extended a trembling hand toward Scheherazade. The courtyard erupted in a chorus of sighs, the night air tasting of fresh rain after a long drought. With the knot finally undone, the kingdom breathed a collective finally, and Scheherazade's voice, once a thread binding them all, now sang of peace, forgiveness, and the odd joy of having survived 1,000 bedtime stories. When Shahryar finally softened, the night-long whispers of Scheherazade froze into a leather-bound tome that smelled of incense and old ink. Courtiers gathered around the flickering oil lamps, inhaling the spicy aroma of cumin-seeded tea, while the scribe's quill scratched like a restless desert wind. The king's heart, once as hard as desert stone, pulsed with a new rhythm, and the stories settled into a canon as solid as a stone-carved archway. This collection, stitched together with love, revenge, and a dash of clever bribery, became the first official 1001 Nights, a literary banquet for the soul. Centuries later, the manuscript slipped across the Mediterranean like a mischievous dolphin, landing in the damp basements of Venetian bookshops. Italian translators wrestled with Arabic metaphors, their pens dripping olive oil and wine as they chased elusive puns. By the time a French aristocrat snorted the pages, the scent of sandalwood had mingled with the sour perfume of cheap pewter ink. The European elite, half enchanted and half confused, christened the work Les Mille et Une Nuits, turning palace soirées into storytelling marathons. Even the court jester whispered, if Scheherazade were alive today, she'd binge-watch Netflix and still outplot the reality TV drama. Adaptations sprouted like desert roses after a rainstorm, each one a wild remix of the original tale. A German composer set the nights to a symphony that crackled with timpani thunder, while a British playwright turned Aladdin into a punk rock hero, swinging a neon-lit lamp. In the bustling markets of Delhi, street storytellers added the sizzle of frying samosas to the narrative, making the audience's stomach growl in sync with the plot twists. The stories seeped into children's picture books, comic strips, and even a video game where players dodge cursed genies in pixelated dunes. All the while, the core of Scheherazade's cleverness twinkled like a lantern refusing to be dimmed. The legacy of the 1,000 Nights proved as elastic as a bizarre rope, stretching across continents without losing its knotty charm. Scholars in dusty libraries cataloged each variant, their spectacles fogged by candle smoke, as they argued whether a particular fox was truly a trickster or merely misunderstood. Meanwhile, pop culture devoured the tropes, gifting us superhero movies where heroes bargain with djinns for extra lives. The tale's smell, spiced dates, camel dung, midnight desert sand, still clings to us, reminding that great storytelling is never pristine. It's gritty, sweaty, and wildly human. In every retelling, Scheherazade's voice roars louder, proving that a well-told story can outlive even the most stubborn king. So when you hear someone say, just another bedtime story, imagine instead a caravan of ink-stained camels rattling through your mind, trailing scents of incense and roasted chestnuts. The 1,000 Nights have become the ultimate cultural remix, a playlist that never stops looping, each track sampled by a new generation of dreamers. If Shakespeare and Scheherazade ever met over a cup of chai, they'd likely argue about who had the better plot twist, only to realize they were both just clever writers who loved a good cliffhanger. And as long as there are listeners willing to stay awake past midnight, the nights will never truly end. After all, who needs a Netflix binge when you have 1,001 stories waiting to be whispered into the darkness? When the sun rose over the brick-tiled roofs of Konya, the city unfurled like a tapestry of market stalls, donkey cries, and sizzling kebab grills. In the heart of this 13th century bustle, a young scholar named Jalal ad-Din Rumi taught theology from a stone-capped courtyard, his voice echoing against minarets that smelled of incense and spilled wine. Rumi wore the neat, embroidered robes of the Seljuk court, his beard neatly groomed, and his reputation for sharp logic made even the most stubborn vizier pause before he spoke. He loved the orderly world of grammar and law, but his heart secretly thumped to the rhythm of a dervish drum he had never heard. One dusty afternoon, a caravan thundered into Konya, its camels kicking up clouds of grit that glittered like stardust in the market's lantern light. The clatter of wooden wheels and the clamor of traders created a chaotic symphony, while a troop of whispering dervishes slipped from the shadows, their scarves swirling like kaleidoscopic smoke. At the front rode Shamsi Tabriz, a wandering mystic whose eyes sparkled with mischief and whose smile seemed to carry a secret punchline the city had never heard. He dismounted with a flourish, scattering sand over the cobbles, and tossed a single rose petal onto Rumi's desk, as if saying, "I'm here to rewrite your script." The crowd held its breath, half expecting fireworks, half wondering if the newcomer had misplaced his GPS. Rumi's students stared, eyebrows knitting like tangled prayer rugs, while the court's scribes whispered that Shams was a rogue poet-pirate, stealing verses from the heavens. Even the palace cooks, who usually complained about burnt flatbread, muttered that the air now smelled of wild figs and strange incense, a perfume that made their stomachs churn with curiosity. Rumi felt an uneasy tickle in his chest, a mix of academic pride and the thrill of a plot twist he hadn't rehearsed. He invited Shams to tea, and the steam rose like curling scrolls, while Rumi tried to keep his scholarly composure, though his mind raced faster than a horse on a desert sprint. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who spent his life decoding ancient law now found himself decoding a man who seemed to have walked straight out of a Sufi Instagram reel. Over cups of thick, sweet sherbet, Shams spoke in riddles that bounced off the walls like tennis balls, each one landing in a different corner of Rumi's intellect. He laughed at the idea that truth could be measured by ink alone, insisting instead that it smelled like fresh rain on cracked earth and tasted like honey-dripping figs. Rumi, who usually counted verses like coins, found his notebook turning into a squeaky toy as Shams tossed metaphors that squawked and sang. The two men began to dance, Rumi's measured steps meeting Shams's whirling spins, creating a rhythm that made the whole courtyard feel like a living, breathing poem. Even the city's stray cats paused, ears twitching, as if they sensed the birth of a new kind of love story, one that blended scholarship with ecstatic madness. Word of their friendship spread faster than gossip at a camel market, reaching the ears of stern imams who imagined a battle between a disciplined accountant and a party animal DJ. Rumi soon realized that his once tight world of doctrine was cracking open, like a cracked pottery jar spilling golden grains of new ideas. He felt the thrill of a Jedi discovering the Force, except the Force was a whirling dervish wind that threatened to knock his turban off. In the days that followed, the two would spar with verses like swords, each blow blurring the line between faith and reason, humor and horror. And as the sun set behind the Seljuk citadel, the city heard a faint, mischievous chant echoing through the streets, a promise that the caravan had not just arrived, but had planted a seed that would grow into a garden of wild, ecstatic poetry. When Shams stepped into Kanya's sun-baked courtyard, the wind seemed to sigh his name, scattering the dust like a mischievous kid with glitter. He wore a threadbare cloak that smelled of goat milk and roasted cumin, and his eyes flickered with a wild, untrained fire that made the scholar's robes rustle in uneasy applause. Rumi, perched on his marble dais, felt a sudden rush of heartbeats, as if the city's ancient clock had sprinted ahead a few ticks. The whispering wind carried Sham's laughter across the bazaar, promising a storm of love that would rattling the very foundations of the madrasa. Rumi's disciples gathered behind the library's heavy oak doors, their whispered debates sounding like a secret reality show confessional. One hushed elder muttered, "Did you see him hug the reed basket vendor? That's a scandal hotter than a furnace in a spice shop." Their faces flushed with a mix of admiration and fear, for Shams's radical teachings scraped against the polished doctrine like a cat clawing a polished marble statue. Yet the more they argued, the more the wind snuck in, slipping scented parchment through cracks, delivering verses that smelled of jasmine and rebellion. One night, under a moon that looked like a silver coin tossed into a dark pool, Shams and Rumi sat on cracked tiles, their dialogue spiraling like a dervish's spin. Shams shouted, "Love is a wild horse, not a tame mule," while Rumi answered with a soft chuckle, "Then let me be the rider who forgets the saddle." Their words dripped like honey-soaked figs, each syllable painting the night with a sweet, intoxicating perfume that made even the stone pillars sigh. The city's clergy, cloaked in incense-laden robes, heard the echoes and frowned, fearing that devotion was turning into a rock concert of the soul. In the bustling market, the scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with the metallic tang of swords, and merchants swapped stories about the wandering mystic like juicy gossip about a celebrity scandal. A young girl giggled. "Shams told the camel to sing, and the camel sang better than my aunt's karaoke," while an old faqih muttered, "If love were a spice, this man would be pepper, too sharp for our refined palate." The wind, now a mischievous messenger, lifted the rumors into the minaret's shadow, where they clung like stubborn cobwebs, making the clergy's eyebrows rise higher than the city's tallest minaret. Even the pigeons seemed to coo in disapproval, flapping their wings with a rhythm that matched the beat of an unseen drum. As days turned to weeks, the bond between master and disciple deepened, their conversations growing louder than the market's clamor, yet softer than a lover's whisper. Shams's presence stirred a restless energy that made the madrasa's stone floors vibrate like a bass line in a modern-day blockbuster. Meanwhile, the clergy tightened their scrolls, drafting sermons that warned against the wild wind that threatened to blow away centuries of orderly thought. Yet the wind, ever playful, whistled through the alleyways, promising that love, like a stubborn stain, would not be easily washed away, and that the city of Kanya would never be the same. When Shams slipped into the shadows of Kanya like a mischievous cat, the whole city felt a sudden chill, and Rumi's heart cracked with the sound of a dropped goblet. The master scholar, who usually paced his study in polished sandals, now shuffled barefoot on the dusty courtyard, his mind a storm of unanswered prayers. He stared at the empty spot where Shams's laughter usually lingered, and the silence smelled like stale incense and wilted roses. Grief seized his breath, turning his once steady syllables into a ragged chant that echoed off the stone walls. Night after night, the moon hung low, a silver pancake over the city, while Rumi lay awake on a thin mat that creaked like an old wooden floorboard. In the darkness, vivid visions burst forth, a blazing firefly army marching across the heavens, a whispering river that tasted of honey and rust. He heard the divine murmur in the wind's sigh, felt the sting of distant thunder on his cheek, and smelled the sharp bite of desert sand They were drenched in sorrow, wrapped in yearning, yet tinged with a strange, hopeful glow. He wrote of a broken heart that beat like a drum in a tavern, its rhythm calling out to the beloved beyond the veil of flesh. The words smelled of ink and jasmine, tasted of bittersweet dates, and resonated with the hum of distant ney flutes. As he scribbled, an unexpected understanding emerged, that the ache of loss was a doorway, not a dead end, leading toward the unity of the seeker and the unseen lover. Rumi couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. Here he was, the professor of logic, now turned into a lovesick teenager, spilling metaphors like a busted soda can in a bazaar. He likened his plight to a modern superhero whose sidekick vanished, leaving him to fight the villainous emptiness with only poetry as his cape. Even the street vendors paused, their sizzling kebabs pausing mid-sizzle, as his verses floated through the air like scented smoke rings. The humor softened the ache, reminding everyone that even saints can have a sitcom moment when the universe plays a prank. In the end, the broken heart began to turn, like a compass needle finding true north after a wild spin. Rumi felt his soul lift, as if a dusty carpet had been swept clean, revealing a sparkling mosaic beneath. The turning of his spirit echoed through the courtyard's arches, a melody that combined grief, joy, and the sweet smell of fresh rain on hot stone. He realized that Shams's disappearance was not an ending, but a catalyst, urging the poet to merge his own breath with the breath of the beloved. And so, with a grin and a tear, Rumi sang the final stanza, letting his soul pirouette toward the infinite dance of love. In the dusty bazaars of 13th century Kanya, a storm brewed inside Jalal al-Din Rumi as sharply as the pistachio-scented wind that rattled the city's arches. The sudden death of his beloved mentor Shams left his heart in a knot tighter than a weaver's loom, and his mind thumped like a drumbeat in a tavern. Rumi paced the marble courtyard, his sandals scuffing against stone, while the call to prayer droned like an old vinyl record on loop. He felt the divine whispering through the clatter of merchant carts and the smell of roasting lamb, teasing him with a promise of something larger. It was as if the universe nudged him. Hey, why not turn that heartbreak into a masterpiece? One night, under a flickering oil lamp that sputtered like a nervous firefly, Rumi plunged his quill into ink and began the Masnavi, a poetic saga that would stretch over 1,000 pages. Each line poured out like honey spilling from a cracked jar, sweet yet sticky, drenching his soul in verses about love, loss, and the absurdity of human ego. He wrote of lions that roared in the desert, and of lovers who slipped on banana peels, sprinkling humor amid the mystic gravitas. The scent of parchment mingled with the musk of incense, creating a heady perfume that made his neighbors wonder if a saint or a mad poet lived next door. By sunrise, he had composed a stanza that felt like a cosmic high five, sealing his inner turmoil into a radiant climax. The next morning, Rumi gathered a handful of curious disciples and demonstrated the whirling dance that would later christen the Mevlevi order. He lifted his arms, spun clockwise, and his robe swirled like a dervish-style tornado, sending clouds of dust and rose-petal perfume spiraling around the courtyard. The rhythmic shuffling of their bare feet on the stone floor sounded like a drum circle gone elegant, while the soft sighs of participants rose like a choir of gusty air conditioners. Sweat slicked their brows, and the taste of salty tears mixed with the tang of cumin from the kitchen, grounding the ethereal motion in raw human flesh. It was a dizzying, almost comical sight. Imagine a medieval TikTok challenge where everyone tries to stay upright while seeking the divine. Word of the whirling spread faster than gossip about a new bizarre spice, and soon a fledgling brotherhood formed around Rumi's teachings, christened the Mevlevi order. They met in a modest lodge where the floor creaked under their weight, the air thick sizzling sage and stale cheese left over from the night's feast. New initiates clumsily attempted the spin, crashing into each other like bumper cars, yet each tumble sparked laughter that echoed through the stone walls. Rumi watched, his eyes twinkling like neon signs in a desert night, as his followers turned mishaps into moments of grace, proving that divine love tolerates a few bruised egos. Their gatherings felt like a living, breathing tapestry, each thread vibrating with ecstatic sound, scent, and the occasional stray goat snoring in the background. Over time, the whirling became more than a dance. It morphed into a vivid metaphor for the soul's ascent, spiraling upward like a filament of smoke from a campfire seeking the heavens. Spectators saw the dervish's skirts blur into a kaleidoscope of turquoise and gold, hearing the soft rustle that resembled a lover's breath against the night's cool skin. The motion embodied Rumi's revelation. To love is to spin, to surrender, and to let the world whirl around you while you stay centered, like a pizza stone in a bustling oven. Even skeptics could not ignore the electric charge in the air, the way hearts beat in sync with the spin, as if the universe had hit the perfect playlist. In that ecstatic climax, Rumi's inner turmoil transformed into a luminous beacon, guiding seekers through the chaotic bazaar of existence toward the ultimate jam of divine love. When the last breath slipped from Rumi's chest, the wind over Konya's stone streets seemed to sigh with a strange perfume of sandalwood and stale ale, as if the city itself were exhaling a sigh of relief. The dervishes swirled around his simple stone tomb, their skirts rustling like ancient parchment being turned. Children chased stray cats through the courtyard, their laughter cracking the solemn hush like a pop culture remix of a 12th century chant. Even the scorching Anatolian sun felt softer, as though it too wanted to hug the mystic's lingering love. In that moment, the world held its breath, waiting for the echo of his verses to find a new stage. Soon after, caravans of ink-stained scholars slipped through desert passes, clutching handwritten scrolls that smelled of camel sweat and ink-drenched figs. They tucked Rumi's verses into the crevices of bazaar stalls, where spice merchants hawked turmeric that tingled the nostrils like his metaphors tingled the soul. A wandering Sufi in Spain whispered his couplets to a troubadour, who later sang them in a tavern that reeked of spilled wine and damp wood, the melody drifting like a scented breeze across the Pyrenees. By the time the first printing press hiccuped in Istanbul, Rumi's words were already doing the literary equivalent of a TikTok dance, spreading faster than any rumor about the latest celebrity breakup. Each new tongue that caught his rhyme added a layer of flavor, from the buttery richness of Persian tea to the sharp bite of modern coffee shop playlists. Rumi's stories, those daring little rebellions of love against ego, rewrote the rulebook of Sufi thought like a mischievous graffiti artist tagging a sacred shrine. He turned the mystic's quest into a love letter to the universe, and the scent of rosewater in prayer rooms began to mingle with the gritty aroma of market stalls, reminding seekers that divinity could wear a mud-splattered apron. His tales of the reed flute, longing for its source, made scholars chuckle. Imagine a philosopher comparing human yearning to a broken Wi-Fi signal, forever searching for a stronger connection. Sufi masters started quoting him as if he were the original influencer, his verses becoming the meme templates for spiritual teaching. The irony was delicious. A man who warned against attachment became the most unattachedly attached figure in Islamic mysticism. Persian literature caught Rumi's fever and sprouted blossoms of its own, each poem dripping with the honeyed taste of his metaphors and the smoky aftertaste of hearth fires. Poets like Hafez and Sadi swiped his style like a 15th century version of binge-watching a favorite series, remixing his couplets into their own lyrical dramas. Even modern novelists in Tehran sip strong black tea his verses on their phones, the screen's blue glow echoing the candlelight under which Rumi once wrote. In the West, a Netflix documentary titled Rumi, the original soul search engine, aired, prompting viewers to chant his lines in yoga studios scented with eucalyptus, where the smell of sweat and incense collided like a cosmic remix. This cross-cultural love affair proved that Rumi's pen was mightier than any sword, carving pathways through centuries like a seasoned DJ scratching vinyl. Today, his words flutter in digital classrooms, in podcasts that drip with the aroma of fresh coffee and the occasional whiff of teenage angst, proving that love's perfume never ages. Spiritual influencers quote him while unboxing crystals, their hands trembling with the same reverence Rumi felt when he lifted a teacup to the heavens. The echo of his love resonates in every heart that dares to whisper, "I am yours," whether that heart beats in a bustling Istanbul market or a quiet New York subway car smelling of subway tar and pretzels. As the moon rises over Konya, the tomb still hums, a low, timeless bass line that reminds us all, death is just a pause before the next verse. And so, Rumi's earthly journey closes with a smile, his love spilling outward like a fragrant, endless bloom. The sun hammered the mud-splattered docks of Basra like a cosmic grill, and the salty wind carried the clamor of merchants, goats, and gossip in equal measure. Among the tangled ropes and the scent of spiced meat, a wiry boy named Sinbad stared at the horizon, his eyes sparkling like polished brass. He imagined islands that rose from the sea like giant jelly beans, and treasure chests that sang louder than the town criers. Folks whispered that the sea was a fickle lover. She could cradle a sailor in silk or toss him onto a reef with the gusto of a reality show twist. Yet for Sinbad, the call of the waves sounded louder than any market haggle, and his heart thumped the drumbeat of adventure. One swarthy merchant named Hakim drifted into the tavern, his beard smelling of cumin and old stories. He spotted Sinbad's wide-eyed stare, and with a grin that could sell sand in the desert, offered the boy a seat at his table. Over mugs of frothy date wine, Hakim narrated voyages where whales sang lullabies and storm clouds formed the shape of a dragon's eye. He winked, saying, "If you want to chase fortune, you need a ship sturdier than your mother's kitchen floor. Otherwise, you'll end up like a gull on a garbage heap." Sinbad, half amused, half horrified, signed a pact sealed with a handshake that smelled faintly of fish scales and destiny. The next dawn, a gleaming dhow named al-Rashid bobbed at the pier, its wooden ribs dark as a coffee bean, and its sails as white as fresh laundered socks. Sinbad's crew assembled like a mismatched superhero squad. Farid, the grizzled helmsman who could navigate by the twitch of a pigeon. Layla, the spice seller whose laugh could crack a coconut. And a pair of teenage brothers who argued over whether the sea was Wi-Fi or dial-up. They slung barrels of fragrant cumin, sacks of dates, and a mysterious crate that hissed like a cat trapped in a bag. The deck smelled of tar, sweat, and the lingering perfume of seaweed that clung to their boots like an over-enthusiastic hug. When the captain cried, "Hoist the mainsail," the fabric unfurled with a roar that could make a camel sneer, and the dhow lurched forward, eager to bite the horizon. But the Indian Ocean did not greet them with a polite wave. Instead, monsoon winds roared in, a wall of humid air that slapped the sailors' faces like a mischievous prankster. Rain pelted the deck, turning the wood slick as an oil spill, while lightning etched jagged scars across the night sky. The crew clutched the railings, their boots slipping on the soggy planks, yet the promise of glittering gold in distant ports kept their chests puffed with stubborn optimism. Sinbad imagined pearls larger than his grandmother's teacups and silks that would make a peacock blush, fueling his resolve to wrestle the tempest. rose, painting the water in shades of mango and mahogany. The crew shouted a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a karaoke rendition of Eye of the Tiger. Sinbad laughed, realizing that destiny smelled of salted sweat and the occasional burnt fish, but it tasted sweet enough to make a pirate cry. He raised his fist toward the sky, promising the sea that he would return with stories richer than Netflix binge-watching marathons. The dhow slipped away, its wake a frothy breadcrumb trail for future generations of dreamers who would hear the same siren call. And so, with the monsoon behind them and the promise of wealth ahead, the legend of Sinbad the Sailor began its first daring chapter, one that would make even Poseidon raise an eyebrow. The sky blackened as a monstrous cyclone hurled itself across the Persian Gulf, its wind howling like a chorus of angry jinn. Sinbad's sleek galleys, once proud as peacocks, shivered under the onslaught, their sails ripped to tatters that flapped like wounded birds. Rain hammered the deck, turning the wood into a slick, greasy grill that smelled of iron and ozone. The crew gripped the railings, their faces twisted in a mix of dread and grim determination, while the captain barked orders louder than the thunder. Even the seasoned sea monkey among them wondered if this tempest had been summoned by a vengeful god or a mischievous programmer glitching reality. When the cyclone finally spent its fury, the battered fleet limped into a hidden reef that rose like a jagged tooth from the sea. The hulls cracked, spraying splinters of pine and the sickly sweet scent of crushed coconut that floated from nearby wrecks. Water poured into the galley, soaking the spiced stew and turning it into a salty, mushy mess that clung to their boots. Sinbad swore on his most prized compass that they would not surrender to the rocks, even as the ship shuddered and sighed its final lament. The crew scrambled onto the reef, their sandals squelching in the muck, and began the grim task of carving a makeshift shore camp amidst the wreckage. As night fell, the sea turned silver, and a soft, otherworldly melody slipped through the gulls, humming like a karaoke night at a Sumerian tavern. The sirens, half woman, half sea foam, emerged from hidden coves, their voices weaving promises of endless treasure and a Netflix binge of heroic epics. Some sailors, eyes glazed, swayed as if under a love song from a pop star, their throats dry and their hearts beating to the rhythm of doom. Sinbad, remembering an old trick taught by a mischievous monkey, ordered his men to plug their ears with wax and to chant a rousing shanty about shrimp tacos. The cacophony of salty chants drowned the sirens' enchantments, and the crew laughed wildly, shaking their heads at the absurdity of battling mythical pop divas with culinary verses. With the sirens silenced, the sailors set about salvaging what they could from the broken hulls, hoisting timber with rope that smelled of tar and sweat. They fashioned a crude but seaworthy raft, fastening planks together with iron nails that clanged like a medieval metal concert. A clever deckhand rigged a makeshift pulley using shimmering as if moonlit sea spray had seeped into the fibers. The cartographer's riddles, tiny sea serpents curling around the margins, promised a chain of islands that vanished when the tide turned. With a grin wider than his ship's prow, he ordered the crew to follow the northeast wind, their sails snapping like cheap popcorn under a storm. The gulls cackled overhead, seemingly aware they were about to be part of a legend they'd heard at every tavern. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the first phantom shore waited, breathing like a living dream. The first island rose like a blister on the water, its cliffs coated in slick algae that smelled of rotten fish and brine. As soon as the deck touched sand, a pack of ravenous sand tigers, striped as desert dunes and snarling with the sound of clanging cymbals, lunged from the shadows. Sinbad ducked, feeling the hot sand bite his boots, while the crew flailed like toddlers learning to swim in a bathtub. He cracked a joke about the beasts having better dental hygiene than most palace courtiers, buying himself a moment's pause. After a chaotic chase, he seized a shimmering conch, blew it, and the tigers froze, bewildered by the haunting melody that reminded them of bedtime stories. Swept onward, the next island shimmered on the horizon, a mirage that flickered like a bad Wi-Fi signal. Palms rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm, each leaf whispering sweet promises of endless feasts and cool moonlit pools. Sinbad stepped onto what felt like silk, only to have it slide away, revealing a pit of scorching sand that hissed like a kettle left too long on the fire. He laughed, noting that even the desert's illusion had better fashion sense than some of his rivals' tunics. With a quick roll, he caught a glint of a hidden stone marker, using it to navigate through the deceptive light until the real ground steadied beneath his boots. The final phantom isle unfolded into a bustling bazaar, its stalls draped in ruby-red awnings that fluttered like flags at a rock concert. Merchants hawked spices that sang, cinnamon that crooned like an opera singer, pepper that crackled like fireworks, and a saffron so vivid it smelled like sunrise on a fresh loaf. The air was thick with the pungent perfume of cumin mingling with the sour tang of fermented kelp, making Sinbad's nose twitch in delight and disgust at once. A mischievous monk offered him a vial of forget-me-not powder, warning that a single breath would erase the memory of his most embarrassing moment. Apparently, a childhood incident involving a runaway donkey and a royal banquet. Sinbad, ever the opportunist, bartered a polished amber bead for a sack of the singing cinnamon, promising the vendor a tale of his daring for future bedtime stories. With the spice-laden sack cradled like a newborn, Sinbad set sail, the phantom islands receding into the mist as if embarrassed by his triumph. The crew cheered, their voices echoing over the hull like a chorus of sea foam, while the map's ink faded, leaving only a single dot where the market once glimmered. He mused that the line between myth and reality was thinner than a parchment cut by a monk's dull quill, yet just as prone to tearing under a careless swipe. As the sun dipped, painting the water in molten gold, Sinbad whispered to the wind, "Next time, I'll bring popcorn for the sand tigers." And somewhere beyond, a hidden island winked, ready to test the next sailor foolish enough to read a map that liked to play hide-and-seek. The night was black as a soot-stained tunic, and Sinbad's sleek brig creaked like an old tavern door. A monstrous silhouette rose from the abyss, eyes glimmering like polished amber, its tentacles dripping with brine and the scent of rotten kelp. The crew gasped, clutching their oars as the beast slammed its gnashing beak against the hull, rattling the planks with a rhythm that sounded like a drum solo gone wrong. Sinbad, heart thudding like a war drum, whispered a curse to the gods and steadied his grip on the mainmast. The Kraken's grip tightened, squeezing the ship until the wood sang a mournful squeak. Quick as a desert fox, Sinbad flung a coil of rope over a writhing tentacle, feeling the slick skin slide like wet silk under his fingers. He then dumped barrels of fragrant oil onto the beast's than a greased eel on a dance floor. The crew, cheeks slick with sweat and sea spray, scrambled to secure the rope while muttering prayers to any deity who liked dramatic rescues. Remembering the cryptic teachings of the desert sage, who once told him that every leviathan fears a whirl of its own making, Sinbad ordered his men to cut the rope in a spiraling knot, forming a vortex of slick oil and rope twine. He then lit a torch, its flame flickering like a tiny sunrise, and tossed it into the water, coaxing a miniature whirlpool that grew as fast as a viral meme. The spinning water sucked the kraken's tentacles toward its center, the monster's roar echoing like a bad karaoke rendition of a sea shanty. With a sly grin, Sinbad compared the scene to a Game of Thrones battle, only with less drama and more slime. As the whirlpool tightened, the beast's eyes widened in terror, realizing it had become the very thing it fed upon. The whirlpool yanked the kraken free, snapping its grip on the brig like a snapped fishing line, and the ship lurched back into calmer seas, creaking but intact. The crew erupted in cheers, splashing water that smelled like incense and diesel, while the beast thrashed impotently, its limbs flailing like an overcooked octopus in a kitchen. With the monster distracted, Sinbad guided the brig toward the fabled island of diamonds, whose cliffs glittered in the moonlight like a giant crystal chandelier. They anchored at a cove where the sand sang under their boots, each step crunching with the sharp tang of mineral perfume. There, half buried in glittering dunes, lay chests overflowing with jewels that reflected starlight, a treasure worthy of a legend and a good Instagram post. Back on deck, Sinbad brushed a speck of diamond from his cheek and laughed, noting that the only thing more terrifying than a sea monster was his stomach after eating the ship's stale hardtack. He toasted the desert sage with a goblet of spiced wine, joking that the old man's advice was as reliable as a GPS on a camel. The crew, still shaking off the slime, sang a bawdy sea shanty about tentacles and treasure, their voices echoing over the waves like a rock concert in a bazaar. As dawn painted the horizon in hues of gold and blood orange, Sinbad felt a familiar tug of wanderlust, ready to chase the next adventure beyond the horizon. And so, with a belly full of jewels and a heart still beating like a drum, he set sail once more, leaving behind the kraken's maw and a story that would make even the gods grin. When Sinbad's ship finally slipped into Basra's tangled harbor, the dockside lanterns flickered like fireflies trapped in oil lamps. The salty breeze carried the clamor of merchants hawking pistachios and the sour perfume of fermenting dates. He stepped onto the cracked cobblestones, his boots still caked with barnacle slime and the faint scent of seaweed. Around him, children chased a rogue goat that had escaped a spice vendor, bleating like a startled trumpet. The bustling city greeted him not with trumpets, but with the guttural shouts of sailors swapping exaggerations over mugs of date wine. Sinbad hauled his chests of gold, jeweled goblets, and a cursed, yet oddly shiny parrot that squawked ancient curses in a voice that sounded like a broken jukebox. He set the treasures on the market's wooden table, where the copper coins clanged like cymbals and the silks rippled like desert dunes in a windstorm. As curious onlookers gathered, he began his stories, weaving the monstrous whale that swallowed him whole with the tiny crab that taught him patience. Both real and mythic, like a Netflix documentary that refuses to pick a side. The crowd gasped when he described the island of the giant birds that dropped coconuts like meteor showers, and they laughed when he admitted the birds had a better sense of direction than his own compass after a night of too much wine. Somewhere between the roar of applause and the clatter of merchant scales, the line between folklore and fact blurred like ink in a rainstorm. Yet the triumph tasted a bit like old fish that had soaked too long in the sun, rich, but with a lingering sour afterbite. Sinbad confessed, in a voice as dry as desert sand, that the greatest loot was the scar on his shoulder from the giant's claw, a reminder that hubris rides a fickle tide. He warned the eager apprentices that treasure can attract rats the size of cats, which love to gnaw on the very maps that guide you home, turning charts into confetti. His humor dripped like honeyed oil. If you think the sea is calm, just wait until you hear a merchant's bargain for a used rope. It's like hearing a toddler argue with a dragon. The lesson settled like a heavy anchor in their hearts. Glory is fleeting, but humility keeps the hull from cracking. That evening, under a moon that shimmered like spilled mercury, Sinbad gathered the next generation of sailfolk around a crackling fire. He taught them to read the wind's whispers, to taste the brine on their lips, and know when a storm was brewing before the clouds even threatened the horizon. With each tale, he etched a line in the oral tradition, a living saga that would be recited on deck decks long after his beard turned silver as a ship's mast. He also scribbled a few rough notes into a weather-worn logbook, ensuring the annals of maritime history would record his voyages alongside the myths, like a director's commentary added to an epic film. The apprentices left with a grin, clutching both a piece of polished amber and a brand new fear of sea serpents that might actually be oversized eels with a flair for drama. Years later, sailors would swear they saw a phantom ship bearing Sinbad's banner, its sails emblazoned with a cartoonish dragon that looked suspiciously like a certain green alien from a 1970s TV show. The legend grew, hopping from tavern to tavern like a gossip-filled courier, until even the Sultan's court whispered about the Nawas captain of the cosmic galleons, a title no one could quite prove or disprove. In bustling bazaars, children traded tiny wooden boats for stories of Sinbad's daring, while scholars in dusty libraries catalogued his exploits beside